Wow, so many exciting things happening. Are you excited? You are? And can't believe New Vine is turning 6. That's a long time. New Vine is not a young church anymore. Let's see. I've been a part of this church family for almost 20 years. I know that New Vine has only been around for about 6 years, but many of us that started this church started back in San Jose. And one of probably the most important discipline or practice that I have developed that really has helped me to grow over the last 20 years is this habit of opening God's Word every day. So some of you participate in this, but for the last 20 years, I've been trying to read through the Bible in a year. So I would read a passage from Old Testament, a New Testament, and Psalm and Proverb. And this has really helped me to just develop a habit of hearing from the Lord through His Word. And I believe to this day that even though God speaks in different ways, probably one of the most primary way of God speaking to us is actually through His Word. And it's also how we encounter God through His written Word. And sometimes these words just come alive. And I have to tell you, this week I had another one of those experiences or encounters. As I opened the scriptures, we were reading through the Song of Songs. If you remember, it's the Song of Solomon. I know that it's not a book that you normally would open and study, but it just happens that on that day that we were reading through it. So somehow this book just drew me in, and I ended up actually spending the whole morning just reading it over and over and over again. It takes about 15 minutes to read the entire 8 chapters of Song of Solomon. So I've actually ended up reading multiple times, really trying to just unlock. Some of you might remember that about 10 years ago, I had a deep dive into this book, and I actually had a couple of messages on this, not at New Vine, but in San Jose. So it's one of those experiences that I had, and I know that we're going through, or we're almost wrapping up the series on radical, so I could have easily just slapped that word radical on this and could have called it a radical song. Or something like that, but I'm not going to do that because this song really deserves kind of its own attention. So this afternoon, we're going to just have a quick overview of the entire book. I know that this is not one of those books that you run to when you are really searching for God's wisdom or truth, or you want to hear God's voice. This is Song of Solomon's or Song of Songs has almost become one of those non-essential or kind of an optional books that we go to. But, for a reason that this is included in the Bible. We're going to look at that. But this is probably one of the most difficult and challenging books to understand in the entire Bible. The reason is, I'll give you a couple of reasons. Number one, there's actually no mention of God. If you read through the whole 8 chapters, there's not a single mention of God, nor any religious or pious content. Secondly, this is a poetry. It's like a poem. It's like a song. It's a song about love between a man and a woman. There's no other book like this in the rest of the Bible. Let me tell you, you can read through different commentaries and different writings about this book, and yet no other book in the Bible actually has entertained so many different interpretations about what this book is really about. In fact, in the Old Testament times, Jewish rabbis, some rabbis believed that this book was the holy of holies of all the biblical books. There are rabbis who would actually take off their shoes when they open this book and read it. And then there are some rabbis who thought that the content of this book was so dangerous to the carnal mind of our humanity because it's very explicit. It's about love, and some of it is probably like R-rated type of writing. So some people believe that this is actually very, very dangerous to our fallen mindset. And some rabbis actually advise the young people not to read this book until they turn the age of 30. Now, in San Jose this morning, about half the people were all under, or maybe 40%, but here, I don't think we have any underage people, right? Maybe Angus and maybe okay. Actually, we do have several that are underage. So I'm just going to give you freedom. I'm not going to ask you to plug your ears, but I want to encourage you to go back and read it. But I mean, this is how divided even scholars are on this book, and rightly so. Sadly, many scholars who have researched and studied this book, they've actually concluded the Song of Songs is just a collection of writings about human love. Many scholars, even evangelical Christians, have kind of agreed that this is just a collection of Solomon's writing about love, the gift of love, that are written over a period of time, almost like Psalms or Proverbs. And yet, I would like to argue today that this is not something that has been compiled over time. This is actually one solid story that was written for a specific purpose, and we're going to look into some of those meanings today, but you have to really look at this as one coherent story. It's not just a celebration of this divine gift of love that God has given to humanity. This is almost like a riddle. You like riddle? Our family took a vacation this past week on the car ride and around the fire pit. We spent hours kind of challenging each other with these riddles. What is the purpose of a riddle? For fun? For entertainment? There's a purpose that God actually has given us some of these books or writings in the form of riddles or puzzle. If you read Proverbs chapter 25, Solomon, the same person who wrote this book, actually writes this in Proverbs chapter 25. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it's also the glory of the kings to search it out. Some of these truths that we're going to talk about today is almost like a treasure hidden in a field. Do you remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13 as he was explaining some of these things to his disciples? He says, I'm only going to speak in parable. And then he explains why. He says that these secrets of the kingdom are revealed to you, but they are hidden to the eyes of the world. So some of these things are written in a way that is actually hidden or concealed to those people who do not care, but it's written in such a way that for those people who are searching for the truth, they will discover it. So that's the purpose of parable or riddle or puzzle. And what I'm going to do today, I don't want you to just take my word for it. I'm just going to give you a few tools to really unlock this book. And my hope is that you will go back this week and then read actually the whole thing in one sitting, maybe multiple times if you have a little more time. I'm not claiming that I have some secret knowledge about this. But I do feel really convicted that there's a reason why God gave us this book, and there's a truth that God really wants to communicate with His people through this parable. So let me give you just an overview. If you read this entire book, we're going to read just one verse from chapter 5. There's a reason why I chose this verse, because it is really the focal point of this entire book. And it's not going to make any sense to you, but let's go ahead and read it together. I cannot really see, so I'm going to rely on you. Go ahead and read it.
I have come into my garden, my sister. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb and my cake. I drank my wine and my milk. Eat, friends, and drink. Drink your fill of love.
Okay. The difficulty with this book is that when you open Song of Songs, it begins not from the beginning of the story, but in the middle of a story. When you look at some of those movies, there are movies that actually begin to tell the story somewhere in the middle point, and then they actually go back. It's very, very similar in that sense, that the first chapter actually begins with the night before the wedding. This girl who was about to get married, she is in the palace. And then there's this dialogue that happens between the girl and the lover, this man. And it goes on for almost 2 chapters. And then you come to this very strange event that is actually a dream. She's having a dream, or I would even call it a nightmare, but that is actually happening. And then you come to the middle of this book, and then for the first time, King Solomon enters the story, and he's having a procession in the middle of this town. And then chapter 5, verse 1 that we just read is actually an announcement of a wedding. I'll explain how we actually arrive at the conclusion. So that's kind of the progression. And then the story does not end there. There's another dialogue that is happening. This dialogue between the two lovers is almost like they're flirting with each other. Almost for 2 chapters, that there's this conversation that is taking place, and then there's another dream. Actually, I flipped the order. There's another dream that happens. Even a second dream is worse than the first one, and then there's another dialogue, and then the final chapter ends in the vineyard, in the hometown of this girl, the Shulamite girl. So the orders are all mixed up. It's very difficult for us to really understand what is happening. A few keys before you go back and read this book. I'm just going to give you just a few things for you to really have a way to understand and unlock this book. First thing that you have to discover is how many characters are in this story. I don't know about your Bible, but my Bible actually, if you open Song of Songs, it actually has these labels. How many of you carry real Bible? If you are looking at an electronic Bible, you probably will not have the labels. But some translations conveniently labeled all these dialogues and conversations with who's speaking. It's very, very difficult for us to understand because in our English language, we don't have gender or numbers specified in, well, gender, number is in the verbs, but in Hebrews, each of the action verbs actually carry both gender and number. So it's really easier for us to understand who's speaking. And there are at least 5 groups of people in this book. Obviously, there's this man, and then there's this woman. And then there's a group of women called the daughters of Jerusalem. They appear a couple of times throughout the book. And then there's this mysterious man named, in my Bible, is labeled as narrator. There's a man who's actually kind of telling or making the announcement. 5:1 that we just read was actually spoken by the narrator. And then there are these brothers of the women. We don't know how many, but there were many brothers. So we know that there are at least 5 groups of people. But the main question that we have to kind of settle on is how many main characters are in this story. Now, there's a 2-person theory, and then there is a 3-people theory. Let me just explain. The 2-person story is kind of more boring version of this love story. It's between Shulamite girl and this shepherd. And then there is actually a 3-person version where I briefly talked about how King Solomon enters the story. The 3-person version goes like this, that the Shulamite girl fell in love with the shepherd, and yet in chapter 4 and 5, King Solomon wants to win this girl over, so he tries to win her over and marry her, but true love wins in the end. Then the Shulamite girl goes after the shepherd, and then they get married and live happily ever after. It's like a very typical Korean drama. I don't know if you watch Korean drama, but Korean drama never is about 2 people falling in love. It's always 3. There is a 3rd person. So a lot of scholars would actually kind of portray Solomon as an individual figure, but what I want to really argue with you today is that there are only 2 main characters, and it's the man and the woman. I'll explain how that story actually unfolds. So that's the first key for you to really have to understand this book. And the second feature that I want you to really understand is that you really have to lose the chapter division and the verse numbers. When this Bible was written, it actually never had any chapter divisions or numbers. It's something that the writers or the editors put together so that we can easily look for it or look for the verse or easy to just kind of break down the story. But these chapter divisions are actually what confuse us. because we think linear when you look at these numbers. But if we take away all the chapter divisions and verse numbers, there are 4 very, very important markers. It's almost like a stanza that signals this is the end of a section of a song. So whether you want to call it chorus or, bridge, or it's a transition from one part of the story to the next. And there are 4 really important key markers in this entire book, and 3 of them are exactly the same, and 1 is the one verse that we just read. So let me just highlight these. It's chapter 2, verse 7. You can write this down if you're going to, or just record it on your Bible. Chapter 2, verse 7, and chapter 3, verse 5, and chapter 8, verse 4. 2, 7, 3, 5, 8, 4 are the markers that kind of divide the 4 sections or 5 sections of this book, and they're all same. It's almost like a repetition. Let me just read these verses. It's just one verse. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and the wild does of the field, do not stir up or awaken love until the appropriate time. And this gets repeated 3 times throughout the book. So these are the markers that you need to pay attention to. And then there's one more that we just read in 5. Is I have come to my garden, my sister, my bride, eat, friends, drink, be intoxicated with love. So those are the 4 markers. And then the last piece of a tool that I want to give to you is that you have to really understand Hebrew poetry to really unlock this book. Now, a lot of people talk about how Westerners think in linear fashion, like from A to Z, and we just kind of have this event. So, a typical love story goes like this. A boy and a girl meet, and then they fall in love, and then they face some challenges, obstacles, and they learn how to overcome their differences and their challenges and crises, and then they live happily ever after. That's just a very typical linear version of the story, whereas this book is not linear at all. In fact, if you read a lot of Psalms or even some of those prophetic stories or narratives, Hebrew Jewish people think very differently. They actually have this structure that I don't want to go into details, but if you can think of a letter X, that's kind of the format. And scholars call that chiasm or chiastic structure. It's almost like a figure of speech. So let me just explain what this is like. It's almost, if you can imagine just the letter X. The most important point of the story is where those 2 lines intersect, and that's the chiastic structure. And Hebrew or Jewish people will always put the most important point right in the middle and then organize the story in such a way that it'll be almost like a mirror image. Let me just give you an example. If you think of the word Abba, A-B-B-A, that's a chiastic structure. The ideas are presented linearly and then in reverse order, just to kind of create this literally form. Another way to look at it is A-B-C, C-B-A. You get the idea, right? If I say A-B-C-D, and then it'll kind of reverse in order, A-B-C-D, D, C, B, A, and the most important idea would always fall in the middle, almost like a mirror effect. The shortest example. Again, Jesus used this kind of figure of speech all the time. Jesus actually says, Sabbath was made for men, but not man for the Sabbath. Like if you read the actual original Hebrew language, it's almost like a mirror image. Why would Jesus use such expression? It's actually a memory device. It's a teaching method. So Jesus would use these kind of expressions. Again, many of the Psalms and prophetic words are written in this format. Now, I'm going to give you one more example, maybe a little longer and more complex one. It's a very famous verse that Jesus spoke. It's from Matthew chapter 11. Let's just have that up. If you read this, come to me all who labor and are heavy laden. And then section B is, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is a very typical example of this X structure or a chiasm. And Jesus used this kind of expression to really highlight what is the most important part of this saying or command. What do you think is the most important part or the point? It's an invitation. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus is teaching the disciples that he has a whole new way of living your life. And he's inviting people to learn from him this new way, the gospel way of living, which will actually give us the rest for our soul. So I highlighted in different colors so that you can see how this chiastic structure is almost like a poetry. It's not just a random linear thing. So Song of Songs is actually arranged in the exact same format, and I hope this will kind of open your eyes to see how the story is going to actually unfold. So let's just go to the next slide, and I'm going to give you, I briefly gave you different elements of the Song of Songs, but there are 5 different parts that are arranged in such a way that it's actually 4 different parts that are kind of reversed in order. So the first part is actually in the palace. Again, lose the chapter division and pay attention to the markers that I gave you. 2:7 is the end of that. And then there's this long discourse between the 2 lovers, and it ends with King inviting her into the chamber. So that's the second part. And then I talked a little bit about this dream that she has. It's a nightmare. It actually starts from chapter 3. And again, 3:5 is the marker that I told you. So that's kind of the end of one section. And then, starting from chapter 3, verse 6, King Solomon appears in this story. And then there's this wedding that takes place. The whole thing is a wedding procession. And then 5:1 is the announcement of the wedding ceremony. And then the story starts actually reversing. And then you have another dream, dream number 2, which is a worse nightmare. That goes on for almost 2 chapters. And then you go back to this lover's longing, and this time it's the girl, the shepherdess, that is inviting the shepherd to just come with her. And then the last part is a story where she's back in her hometown, in her vineyard, in the countryside. So that's the arrangement of the entire book. So what you have to really understand is that these chapters or progression is not chronological. It's not from yesterday to today to tomorrow, but it's organized in such a way to highlight what is the most important story or a part of the story, and that actually lands right in the middle where the 2 lines meet. What is that one? It's the wedding. It's that chapter 3 all the way through chapter 5:1. So that's really the structure of this whole story. So some of you are wondering where I get the idea that this middle part is actually about a wedding. If you actually talk to any Jewish person, even today, many of them would understand this story very, very differently, because part of a Jewish wedding ceremony is the announcement, and that actually happens in the part called Tish. And that is, you set up this elaborate banqueting table with food and drinks, and then the master of ceremony would come and make the announcement that the food is ready, the drink is ready, eat and drink and be filled with love or whatever. It's like a toast. And then the actual ceremony begins. And chapter 5, verse 1 is exactly that. This King Solomon enters, and then there's this lavish announcement of this wedding banquet that is about to take place. And that is really the highlight of this entire story. So for you to really understand this better, I'm going to have the liberty to kind of rearrange this entire Song of Songs. And I'm going to just give you a brief summary in a linear version or chronological version so that we can have a better understanding. And then I really want to encourage you to go back and read through the entire book. Hopefully twice, 3 times, if you can, to see if this really matches up. So the story actually, if chronologically, it starts with the king who actually ruled over the entire country. And despite all of his responsibilities and busy schedule, he had a really unique habit. He would take his sheep and he would travel to his countryside and then he would retreat. This was like his kind of a rest or hobby, I don't know. But then there on this hillside was a farmer who had many sons and 2 daughters. We don't know how many sons were there according to this song, but he multiple sons, and we know that at least there were 2 daughters. Now, one daughter was only a girl, but there is another daughter who is a shepherdess. She's an older one, and she is the main character of this story. She was a very insecure girl because her skin was very, very dark. The reason is that all her life, she was actually taking care of the farm that belonged to her brothers. So she barely had any time to take care of herself. So her skin was so dark, and in those days, dark skin was not a desirable feature for young women. She was very, very insecure about this feature. And she probably thought that for the rest of her life, that she will probably have to slave away her life to take care of her brother's vineyards. And then one day, she runs into this handsome man. She had no idea where he came from. He was a shepherd. And then she wants to find out where this man actually came from. So she would ask him specifically, where did you come from? And yet this shepherd would always evade the question to not disclose his true identity. After a few encounters like this, of course, she falls in love with this man. And the mundane, ordinary life as a slave to her brothers, now seeing this shepherd every day becomes the joy of her life. And then the unthinkable happens. The man eventually gets down on his knees and asks her to marry her. But there's a twist to this story. The man actually says that I have to go away for a season and I have to take care of some business, but I will come back to marry you. And then he goes away. Now next several months just become really excruciating for her. In those days, there was no email, there was no text message, not even a handwritten letter, there's no telephone. So she's waiting, and she begins to fear that this man actually may never return. She begins to have nightmares. This is where the first dream actually happens in chapter 3. One night, she had a dream of running through the streets looking for her love, but he was nowhere to be found. And then she runs to this guard of the city and asks him, "Have you seen my lover?" And then right at that moment, her lover just flashes before her eyes, and she doesn't miss a chance. She grabs him and then drags him into her mother's master bedroom. And then she tells him that, "I'm never going to let you go." That was the first dream. And then she wakes up. In another dream, I have to be very careful in how I explain this because it gets very, very explicit. So under the age of 30, please plug your ears. She's actually naked in her bed, no clothes whatsoever, and her feet are completely washed. Her hair is all wet because she probably has just bathed. And then her lover appears at the door. She just knows that the lover is at the door, and this lover is actually trying to get inside the house, so he sticks his hand, his arm through the hole of the door, but he cannot get to the bolt. And so this naked woman gets up, runs to the door, and she's trying to open the door for her lover, but her body, her hand is covered with myrrh. It's like a perfume, oil. So imagine with your oily hand trying to open the doorknob. So she struggles and she cannot get the door open, and finally the door opens and she flings the door open, and then her lover is gone, nowhere to be found. Now, you may think that I'm making all this up. It's actually all this is in chapter 5. You can go back and read it. But so she goes out after this event. She's looking for her lover all throughout, but again, he's nowhere to be found. And then she finds probably the same guard in the city, and she asks the guard the same question, have you seen my lover? But this time, instead of just ignoring her, this guard actually beats her, bruises her, and then takes away her cloak, her outer garment. And then she wakes up again. Nightmare number 2. And then the final part is this. One day, people see this glorious procession that is taking place in town. And it was King Solomon who was actually walking through the land. And she's also out on the street trying to figure out what this was all about. And she takes a glance at this man who was riding this chariot, King Solomon. And she realizes that this is the man that she fell in love with, the shepherd boy. And she realizes that this is her wedding day. She had no idea, but the shepherd boy actually kept his promise and he came back. And this story actually ends with this banqueting table that gets set before her. And there's an announcement that goes out that the food is ready, the drink is ready, and let's eat and drink. That's chapter 5, verse 1. Does this ring a bell to you? Does this story sound familiar to you in any way? I mean, there are so many references in what I just gave you that actually relates to some of those stories in the scriptures. What is this story about? It's actually the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is not just God coming down to save us from our sin and then getting us into heaven. There's more to that story. It is actually God pursuing after His people. And then we, as a church, do you remember how the story ends in the book of Revelation? How does the last chapter actually end? It's the marriage supper of the Lamb. Jesus said the same thing to the disciples, that I have to go away. I don't know how many times Jesus used this as a parable to explain to His disciples what must happen. Peter did not want Jesus to go away, but Jesus said, it's better for me to go away. And then He promised. The book of Revelation actually ends with Jesus promising that I am coming back soon. This is really the story of us. Story of how our story is actually supposed to end. So many of Jesus' teaching has these similar elements, the bride and groom, even the communion. Most of us do not understand the full meaning of communion, but when Jesus lifts that cup and He breaks the bread, it's really a marriage covenant that Jesus is making with His people. So what I want to explain to you, again, my hope is that you'll go back and study and read and see if this really matches up with what I'm sharing with you. But I just want to give you just a couple of important thoughts. What this story or what this book is really trying to teach us. What is God really trying to communicate with us? There are two very simple yet profound truths about our faith. And I'll just briefly explain those things. Number one, God is trying to communicate with us that our relationship with Him is a romance. It's a love story. I don't know, when you think about your own faith, your walk with Jesus, some of you really look at it as just a journey of faith, journey of just religious piety. And yet, the entire Bible actually talks about how God comes after us. He pursues after His people, and He makes a marriage covenant with His people. The church is known as the bride of Christ that will be presented at the end of this era or season, our human history. No other religion has ever claimed that a God would actually pursue a love relationship with a group of people. And yet this is really what God is really claiming. This song also reminds us that everything that we do in this life, everything that we do with God is really about Love. The greatest command that Jesus gave us, remember? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, all of your being. Just love the Lord your God. And this is the most important command. Again, it reminds us what our faith is really about. And yet, the sad reality is that along the way, we turn this relationship into a religion. What is a religion? Religion is a transactional relationship. I do this and you do this for me. I want you to think about why you came today. To worship. It's not just to build up our karma or score some points so that God can bless us and give us a happier, more prosperous life. We're here because there's a longing that is taking place in our heart, in our soul. This is a covenantal relationship. You know, it's really interesting that I gave you those 3 markers, right? Chapter 2:7, 3:5, and 8:4, or I forgot the exact verse number. Those 3 markers is the woman that is actually making this statement to the daughters of Jerusalem that she's pleading with these women that I charge you by the wild does and gazelles of the wild that do not awaken your love until the appropriate time. What is she saying? If this is really about our love relationship with God, why would she say that do not wake up or stir up your love until the appropriate time? What she's saying is this. She's saying that if you fall in love like this, it'll cost you everything. There's no way that your life will remain the same. Everything has to change. Think about the cost. It'll take up all of your heart, all of your time, all of your thinking. All of your soul will be given over to this love. And that's why she's making this statement. And that's how we're actually supposed to be in relationship with this God. I want to challenge this afternoon. How many of us are in this lovesick relationship with God, with Jesus? You know, as you read through some of these chapters, this woman is lovesick. That's the only way to describe what is actually happening to her. She's stricken with this love, this romance that she cannot help herself. She begins to have nightmares about her future. The question is, how many of us really live in this sort of reality with God? We all know in our head that it's supposed to be a love relationship. And yet, the way we live our lives or practice our faith is more like a religion, more like a transaction. God, I'll do this and you do this for me. And yet, God is reminding us that our relationship with Him and His relationship with us is supposed to be romance. This is how He feels about His church, about us. The second truth that I want to highlight from this story is that God is reminding us once again that there will be a season of separation. Things will get hard. The season of waiting will seem like nightmares compared to the reality of being united with Him again. And many of us are going through that season right now. Some of you are wondering, is this really worth it? Is this worth waiting? Is this really worth fighting for? I'm not even sure if He's going to come back for me. How will the world come to an end? What will my future look like? All of us were thinking through the same questions, and yet God is reminding us that this season of waiting will come to an end. And He will keep His promise. That's really the last point. The most important point is that Jesus is promising us that He is coming back. This was really His last declaration in the book of Revelation. This is really our blessed hope. And when He comes back, He's not just coming back as our Savior, not just as a healer, not just as our sanctifier. I'm going through all the 4 pillars of our alliance faith. But He's coming back not just as a king, He's coming back as our bridegroom, our lover. That's the whole point. That's the whole story of the gospel. And that we as his bride will not just be sinners saved by God's grace, or just a group of people that are waiting for another reality or just about to enter into heaven, but God is reminding us that we will be the bride of his Son, Jesus. Meaning that everything that belongs to him, all the glory, all of authority, all of his power, all the reality of his possessions and his inheritance becomes ours. That is the blessed hope. And if this is true, this is a song that we should be singing almost every single day of our lives. This is why it's called Song of Songs. It's a Hebrew expression, like Lord of Lords, King of Kings, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. Is when Jewish people use that expression, it means only one thing. It means that it's the greatest. It's the greatest song. It is the most important song that we actually need to go back to and sing. I hope this will really change your view of what the gospel is, what the Bible story actually tells us and promises us. And I hope that this will also change the view of yourself. That I don't know how many of you wake up in the morning thinking like, I'm the bride of Christ. I am my beloved's and he's mine. I am deeply loved, and one day he's coming back to reclaim me, to redeem me. I don't know how many of us live and walk in that reality. And I hope this book will help you to change how you see yourself and how we see one another as the bride of Christ. So sing it, starting tomorrow. Go back and sit down and open the scriptures and read through and see what it tells you. I don't know what you're going through right now. Some of you may feel like you're just going through a very dark season. You're just like this you're going through a nightmare right now. You're trying to really get reconnected with Jesus and you feel like he's gone, he's not there. Some of you feel like you're just not worthy. You've just kind of fallen away too far. And yet, this book is given to us. This song is written for us, not to condemn us, not to put us on a guilt trip, but it's to give us hope and to comfort us of the reality that God is not going to break his promise, and one day he'll show up. The shepherd who we fell in love with happens to be the king of the universe, and you belong to him. That's the glorious truth of the gospel. So live in it, live worthy of this invitation and this call. I'm going to have Pastor John come back and just give us a little bit of time for us to reflect, and then we'll end our time.